And after I'd done the Aqualung album, I went to meet George Martin and to ask his advice. Do you think it would be beneficial for us to get a producer?
It's John Bowden from Rock History Music and part two of our interview just a few days ago with Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull. The album is Aqualung, their biggest album, inspired by a picture that Ian Anderson's then wife took of a homeless man, which we'll get to in this interview. Standout tracks, the title song, of course, Cross-Eyed Mary, Hymn 43, which was kind of a scathing look at religion, and Locomotive Breath. There was a time where Ian Anderson actually talked to Beatles producer George Martin about possibly producing the band. He was fishing a little bit. George Martin told Ian Anderson something that would go on to maybe change the trajectory of that group. We talked to Ian Anderson on Rock History Music. George, when you tell the story, you never told me, but I was reading you talking about Aqualung and talking to George Martin. Of course, the Beatles had just broken up at that point, and asking him his opinion about. Were you outright asking him to produce, or asking him wishful thinking, or were you just asking for his opinion and or?
So he was involved with our managers and the record company Chrysalis, who were kind of buddies with George, and George was apart from the famous Beatles producer, the fifth Beatle, as he was often described as being. He was quite a proactive in the record industry in terms of setting up Air Studios in London and the recording studio in Montserrat in the Caribbean, subsequently destroyed by the volcano there.
Mm-hmm.
But like everybody else, you believed in the creative power and the ability of George Martin to see the essence of a song, perhaps just given in a very crude and unfinished way by the Beatles, and along with them to shape that and develop it through his skills as a musician as well as a recording engineer and producer. He would be a good guy to talk to. And after I'd done the Aqualung album, I went to meet George Martin and to ask his advice. Do you think it would be beneficial for us to get a producer? Because increasingly, I find it's quite difficult with the members of the band for me to take on that role of being the active producer in the studio, telling people what to play and to maintain that degree of discipline. It doesn't sit very well, with the equality of the band members in the general musical and family kind of way, which we kind of are in a band. And he asked my manager Terry Ellis, he said, "Well, how many records did the last one sell?" And so he told him, and George said, "Yeah." And well, I actually listened to that one, and he said, "Yeah, I'm happy to give you some advice. My advice is carry on doing what you're doing. You don't need a producer. You don't need me. You don't need someone like me. What you're doing is what you should do." And it wasn't really what I set out to expect or want to hear, but it did give me a lot of confidence and a feeling of resolution in that query to think, okay, well, I can do this, and if I piss off the drummer, well, that's hard luck. It's going to happen. Or indeed any of the members of the band, if they have to accept that I'm wearing two hats. One is a musician when I'm part of the band. The other one is that I'm a record producer, and I have to book the studios. I have to come up with the working schedules, and I have to guide everybody through the process of recording, which on a technical level was proceeding apace. Back in the early 70s, we went from 8-track recording to 16-track to 24-track, and all of the technology that was developing in the recording industry was, something you really had to stay. You had to stay with. You had to be not ahead of the game, but you didn't want to be too far behind it in terms of understanding how that technology could help us make music. And so that became my role. And George, over the years until he died, we stayed in touch and met up a few times. And he's a very generous, very nice, very much an English gentleman.
Hmm.
He wasn't of aristocratic blood, although his wife was rather grand. But George was well spoken and polite and had the manner of a gentleman. And it must have been quite a strong quite a strong part of the relationship with the Beatles. In a way, I think he was a perhaps a surrogate dad to them. He had that position of being the wise, dignified, calm, knowledgeable, nurturing father in a musical sense. And I think maybe he was a bit of a father substitute for them who didn't necessarily remain close to their parents, or their parents were old or dead. So yeah, it was his role was very important.
Would you tackle Aqualung now? How do you look back at that album now?
Well, there are things in that album that I certainly wouldn't change. I mean, the song that is most poignantly touching upon the role of religion in our relationship with religion is the song "My God." And I wouldn't change that if I went back to write it now. Although I was 22 years old, I think, when I wrote that song. Actually, no, 23 years old, and I was singing a song, casting my mind back to me as a 14, 15-year-old when I started to question the essence of standardized religious belief, religious dogma, and and that's what that song was about. It certainly wasn't anti-religion. If anything, it was very much pro-religion. I'm simply saying, using the language that I had available to me at the time, that God is everywhere. God is within us. We collectively, every living creature in the universe, to my mind, is, if we are conscious, then we are part of that life-giving force that we call God, for want of a better term. And it seems pretty universal, at least in planetary terms, it's universal to us. And I'd be quite astonished if we were to ever encounter an alien race from a distant planet. I'd be quite surprised if they didn't say, "Oh yeah, 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 we have God as well. Yeah, we just call it something different, or we do it in a different way." But I don't live in a world of belief. Belief implies certainty, and I don't do certainty. I believe in possibilities and probabilities. So my feeling about God is it's in the strong probabilities sense, not just a possibility, but a probability. I think, that there are many reasons that we might conclude that God is a real essence, but it's not the man with the long white beard, the Michelangelo kind of God that, we have these pictorial versions of God and Jesus, which have been largely propagated by the Catholic Church in the 400, 500, 600 years after Christ, and particularly during the Renaissance period, where there was a standardized version of Jesus, and he probably didn't really look much like that. He looks too much like a slightly hungry Jim Morrison, or Keith Richard on a good day kind of guy, and it's probable that he didn't actually have those features. So we believe from the stereotypes in Judea and Palestine of that period. But I rather think that, when we take away the pictorial side of it, and this is the thing about Islam and indeed Judaism, we do they do not depict God. The idea of having a pictorial image of God is scandalous and slanderous, and a deeply offensive thing to do, even to picture Muhammad, the prophetic agent of God, just as Jesus is, or to the Jews, amongst others, Moses, Abraham, the so-called Abrahamic religions. Only Christianity dare
Hmm.
show elaborate, detailed pictures of Jesus and indeed God. I mean, how ridiculous! God being this sort of rather swarthy elderly man, looks like me after a 6 months hard working out at the gym, but wearing a wig, and that cannot be God. God is to me much more esoteric and a spiritual essence to which we will one day reunite. But I kind of half go along with the Buddhist belief in there being a series of reincarnations where we come back to try again and see if we can do better than last time, and then maybe once we pass the test, we then skip the material rebirth, the samsara cycle, and we move on to a more spiritual oneness with whatever in the universe is a conscious part of the whole. So it's an interesting to me probable reality which one day I will experience and you may experience, and those who do not have any spiritual belief or belief in God, I don't think that precludes the fact that one day they're going to find themselves going, "Oh wow, yeah, wow!" So it really was like
Yeah.
Father Christmas.
Yeah, and locomotive breath, was that really about overpopulation?
Yes, yes, it was about population growth, but it was talking about what we might now call globalization, so that it is population and its place in the expanding capitalist world that we live in, and it might have seemed back then a difficult subject, and it's a difficult subject today. People don't like to be reminded of. Of the harsh reality of overpopulation, and we everything follows on from that. Everything from the pandemic crisis we're in, you can trace that back to the effect of huge population, the travel, the spread of the disease, everything to do with climate change. You can see how that is vastly exacerbated by population size. So pretty much everything that we might fear and be concerned with in terms of its effect on our great grandchildren and their world to come is linked to population size of planet Earth. I mean, it was observed many, many years ago that probably the optimum population would be somewhere between 2 and 3 billion if we were to find a truly sustainable, workable place in the environment. And even that would depend on the miracles of modern science coming to bail us out of the trouble we get into. But it should be a sobering reality when you consider that when I was born in 1947, the population of planet Earth was, a moderate one. It was kind of looking probably a little heating up, but okay. And if you ask people, well, by how much in my lifetime do you think the population of Earth has grown? They might say, 50%.
Mm-hmm.
Some bullish people might say, 100%. It's probably doubled. I mean, they should be quite shocked to hear that it's actually slightly more than 3 times now what it was when I was born. So in one person's lifetime, we have seen a tripling of our population. And although there are many signs that in many countries that population growth has reversed into a slight decline, and that's the case in most European countries where the fertility rate is down around 1.6 per fertile female.
Mm-hmm.
And that would result in in a slight decline in population over the next 100 years, we would be heading in the right direction. But of course, in other countries, it's still up around 5 or 6 per fertile female. And at that point, because that is occurring in countries perhaps in many cases least able to support population growth, especially in the context of climate change, that's what will result in incredible pressure for migration from people in particularly Africa and parts of Asia to areas such as yours or mine. And we have to learn how to deal with that vast level of pressure for immigration from people who simply are born into a world that, or into a national context that cannot support them. It will make today's world, with a couple of thousand people crossing the English Channel to seek refuge in the UK illegally, or a few thousand people swimming across a river in Texas from Mexico, it will make that look, hey, what were we worried about back then? That's just a trickle. We really have to face up to enormous changes, and that's what I'm trying to say in that song is, we are on this seemingly lemming-like suicide mission in terms of an unstoppable force that we seem incapable of dealing with, and we don't even want to talk about it because no one likes to be told how many children they can or cannot have.
Yeah.
But I think it is a personal responsibility that people should be aware that they can make. When in educated Western world society, where women who are educated have a degree of choice in what happens to them, then they very often are choosing to have smaller families, 1 or 2 children, or sometimes none at all. Hence the reduction in population in Europe. But that's not the case in your country, and it's certainly not the case in the African countries, for example. And it would be a hot potato if someone was to try and tell the American public, maybe you should think about just having 1 or 2 children. I mean, you can imagine that would be even worse than taking their guns away.
Yeah. Marcus Westermark asks, all these are all your fans, do you still do salmon farming?
No. For 20 years, I was very actively engaged in aquaculture and fish processing. And I decided, apart from the financial risk, which was really considerable, I felt uncomfortable increasingly about environmental aspects of salmonid farming because mainly because of the issues of sourcing feed. It meant as salmon farming became more and more popular and industrial in its nature, more and more millions of tons of fish species were being hoovered up from the ocean in order to turn into high protein fish dry feed for salmon, and to turn a lowly form of fish protein into a higher value of fish protein, increasingly became uncomfortable for me. And although there were beginnings of movements towards trying to get salmon to go vegan, to eat essentially a vegetarian protein diet, they were not successful. As it happens right now, about 50%, or maybe even a little more than 50%, is actually vegetable matter that finally now it is palatable enough to be able to feed to salmon. Trout, on the other hand, they would always take a healthy admixture of vegetable matter in their feed. And some fish like carp, for example, are naturally vegan. They just are, they eat nothing but vegetables. Toss in a dead sheep, they're not going to go near it. So that was one of the problems. I think the other environmental issues to do with chemicals was something that, to a large extent, you could avoid and can avoid to this day. So I wouldn't worry about that one. And in terms of the visual aspect of salmon farms, producing a visual pollution in the landscape in remote, idyllic highland lochs, there's something, again, you can't ever make that look pretty. They are very visible, and that's the end of it. But I was always in favor of shellfish farming, and I still am today. If I had remained in aquaculture, it would have been farming mussels and scallops and oysters In other words, the bivalves, because you just put the little guys into the water, and they get bigger because they naturally ingest plankton, which is there as a freebie. So that they don't pollute, they don't do anything. And generally speaking, because they're growing below the surface, there's very little to see on the surface of the water. So a very good reason for sticking with bivalve aquaculture. It's just that having got out of it, I got out of it. And that's the end of it. Not going back. I have my rest of my remaining days as a as a farmer of grass and trees. That's all I do.
D Black asks, would you consider, and I think this is a great idea, ever a biopic on the band? Are there too many pieces, or is it just?
It would be just, if it was truthful, it would be the most uncool, dull movie you ever saw. I mean, I think we'd have to invent a few murders or some extremely excessive rock and roll lifestyle things to make it interesting. But frankly, it's never been like that. It's just, we are one of the world's most uncool band. We just did not live that sort of a life. It's absolutely not romantic. It's incredibly, and it's not just, maybe there's been one person in the band at any one time, not recently, but, maybe up till maybe 20 years ago, there was always one person who was the party guy, and everybody else was the opposite. We just, didn't like socializing or doing things together. Nobody was a big drinker. Nobody took drugs. There was always one guy. And most of those one guys were bass players, as it happens. So more gregarious, outgoing sort of, I guess if you've only got four strings, you want to kind of make up for it somehow.
My ex-boss, Len Tucson, he actually got me in radio 39 years ago. He says, loved his performance at the Stones Rock and Roll Circus 68. What was that experience like with John Lennon, Clapton being there? What's your recollection of that?
Well, that was a people watching experience. It was pretty weird, but it was an interesting place to be, because you were watching the way a TV program, a very unusual TV program, was being made. So I was kind of listening to what the director was just saying, and Mick Jagger trying to communicate his ideas to the director as to what was happening and how it should happen. And it was interesting watching the Stones getting back together again after a layoff, and gradually picking up the pieces again musically, and Mick Jagger's incredible energy and enthusiasm driving them on, maybe to the point where he overstretched it in rehearsal. So the final performance was maybe a bit strained. But the Who were great. They were fighting fit, ready to roll. They'd been on tour. They just went in, bang, and nailed it, and very easy. And, some of the other elements of the show were interesting. But we were the new boys in town. We were just asked by Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts, I think, mentioned to Mick, how about this band, the brand new band that and so we were asked to do it. We didn't have a guitar player at the time, hence Tony Iommi being drafted in to mime the guitar part on the song that we played. Or
well, speaking of him,
I played, the other guys didn't. I was the only one who was live. The other guys were miming.
Oh, was that right? With Tony, what was that experience like working with him? Had you known him? Because he filled in on, he came in on tours.
I'd known him for a few weeks, because a band called Earth had been an opening act for Jethro Tull at the end of 1968, and I was struck by his guitar playing, and chatted to him, and we got together and played a little bit together. But he wouldn't have been the right guitar player for Jethro Tull, and Earth, of course, then changed their name to Black Sabbath, and the rest is history. So. But it was nice to have, briefly got to know Tony. Different kind of person, different kind of musical way of playing. His music was very direct, very, very simple. He was an unusual style, which is what struck me when I heard him play live, and very focused, very, very powerful, simple harmonies, open fifths, solos, big, thick, strong guitar sound. It was very impressive. I didn't realize that his way of playing had been largely directed as a result of having lost the tips off a couple of fingers when he was at work in an industrial setting. And so he played the way he did, rather like Django Reinhardt had to evolve a way of playing, just using mainly two fingers. And Tony, he used his damaged fingers with something over the end of them, but he was not articulate in a way that he could play all the chords and the detailed stuff that other guitarists might play. So he evolved a way to play where he was just, he was the guy. He invented heavy metal in that way, which is brilliant.
We're out of time, by the way.
Yeah, we are indeed.
No, because I don't want you to be too late, but it's 2:05 and I don't want you to be late. But listen, this is the sixth time we've talked. I thank you so much.
Well, nice to talk to you too. Take care, and hope to meet you again sometime soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye.
What was it about 1971? I mean, it was some of the greatest albums of all time were released that year.
In record company terms, it was a pretty competitive time to be marketing and promoting new material, because you were up against the good and the great, who were releasing albums at a furious rate, throughout the early 70s. And it was a tough sell if you were moving towards the Christmas period and you're up against, the new Elton John album or whatever it might be. So, arguably there was an excitement in the air. There was a huge amount of creativity in the air. There was a demand for, what we took for granted, physical product. People wanted to own an LP, big thing with big artwork, and it was a very fruitful time for a great number of artists in a lot of countries. But I think it was a coming of age really at the end of the 60s, which was, if you take the mid 60s, I mean, if you take the Freedom March in Alabama, if you take that as a time where it began to kickstart globally a real awareness of change, it led on to, apart from the racist and racial divide, it led on to the emancipation to a large degree, whether they would accept that has in fact occurred. But for women, there was a degree of freedom that was coming about. Women were able to make choices about contraceptives, about going to school, getting an education, about looking for careers. There was a huge growth. I argue mid 60s, through the end of the 70s was a pretty revolutionary period globally, because it wasn't just the UK or the USA. It wasn't just in Western Europe. We were seeing things radically beginning to change in the countries that were more historically related to fascism and dictatorships, and even as we went through the 80s, then the growing need for some kind of a democracy in Russia and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Yeah. We saw these changes coming about. So it was a very productive time of mostly quiet revolution in global society, starting first in the US and the UK, spreading through Europe, spreading through other parts of the world, and only finally, maybe at the end of the 80s, getting to, or being able to be accessed in Russia, and then later on in countries of South America, for example. It was I think that came about partly because of the freedom of expression in music and the arts, but it also was reflected in music and the arts because we were writing about the stuff that we saw that was change. So I don't think you could say that rock music changed the world. The world changed rock music to pretty much a similar degree. I think it was a very symbiotic relationship between rock music and the way things changed. In Russia, I know that to be the case because lots of people a bit younger than me grew up at a time when it was absolutely forbidden to have Western rock music. It had to be smuggled in on tapes that were copies of tapes that were copies of tapes. Yeah. So, in many countries in Eastern Europe and in the countries that were part of the Soviet Union, it was absolutely prohibited. But under Gorbachev's enlightened period of glasnost and perestroika, the Russian state record label Melodia Records was allowed to release the first two Western albums, which were the Beatles and a best of album by Jethro Tull.
Wow.
We were the first. That was in 1977, and sorry, that was in 1987.
Right.
In 1987, and that was a period when already Elton John, I think, had been to Russia to do some concerts. A few Western acts had gone there, but they were playing in venues absolutely controlled by and only open to
Yeah.
party members. The apparatchiks, those who had special access or knew somebody who did, who would palm them a ticket in return for something else. So they weren't open to the general public. And we turned down, or I turned down the offers to go and perform in Russia for that very specific reason. I said, well, no, not unless I know people really can go out and buy a ticket, regardless of, political belief or social status. That I don't want to go to be playing simply to the Communist Party upper echelon. That defeats the whole point. So we didn't go until a bit later on, and thanks to Gorbachev, these things came about, at least for a period of time. And I've been to Russia many times since, and obviously during the time that Vladimir Vladimirovich has been the boss man.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were supposed to actually do a Russian tour last spring that was postponed to this spring, and now it's postponed to the early months of 2022. So we are due to go once again, and I have to be very careful what I say about Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Yeah. There's more from our interview, which was almost an hour and a half with Ian Anderson, coming up the next few days. We love it when you subscribe to our channel. Click the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Comment on our videos, like them, and share them on social media. If you want to make a donation, there's a donation tab right at the very top of our description. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take good care of yourself.